everybody. Welcome. Before everybody can hear me, right? I think so. Before we start, let's hear quickly from the Babilla Collective, from the folks at Babilla Collective who are going to guide us through their interpretation services. But thank you all so much for coming.
Hi everyone, hola a todos. I'm Pau, soy Pau. I use they, them pronouns, uso los pronombres ella, y soy parte del colectivo Babilla. I am part of Babilla Collective. I'm going to be interpreting simultaneously with my colleague Cristóbal. Vamos a ofrecer interpretación simultánea con mi colega Cristóbal. The interpretation will soon be activated. And if you are on a computer, you're going to be seeing a globe icon at the bottom right corner of your screen. There you can click on that and choose the language that you would like to hear interpretation into. Entonces la interpretación va a ser activada. Van a ver un icono de un globo en la parte derecha al fondo de su pantalla y ahí podrán escoger, hacerle clic y escoger el idioma que quieren y prefieren escuchar. As a trans feminist collective, we will be interpreting using inclusive language. Como colectivo transfeminista, vamos a interpretar usando el lenguaje inclusivo. Please remember to speak at a moderate pace at your capacity. Por favor, de hablar a un paso moderado a su capacidad. If you're speaking too quickly, we will let you know in the chat. Si están hablando muy rápido, le vamos a dejar saber por el chat. Please remember to expand and explain acronyms. If you are reading anything, please read slower. We tend to actually read a lot faster than we speak. And if you ever are giving any numbers, please say them slowly. That's usually one of the hardest things to interpret. And finally, we understand that Spanglish is very much an experience, but please, if you are going to change between English and Spanish, please change within different sentences. Don't change within one sentence. Entonces, por favor, hablen a un paso moderado. Si están hablando muy rápido, le vamos a dejar saber por el chat. Por favor, expliquen siglas. Y si están leyendo algo, por favor, léanlo más despacio. Normalmente hablamos mucho más rápido de lo que leemos. Si están diciendo en algún momento, comentando algún número, por favor, léanlo despacio o díganlo despacio. Y finalmente, sabemos que el Spanglish o el cambiar de entre el español e inglés es una experiencia, pero por favor mantengan un idioma por oración. Es bien difícil para nosotros cambiar entre idiomas. We create these spaces with everyone's support, so please communicate any issues that you have over the chat and enjoy the screening and enjoy the conversation. Creamos estos espacios con el apoyo de todos. Por favor, comunicar cualquier problema por el chat y que tengan buena presentación de la película y la conversación también. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Babilla Collective. We're so happy to be working with you. And welcome everybody officially to the film screening and collaborative viewing guide launch for the amazing film War Against Our Schools. I'm Isabel Guzardo from the Puerto Rico Syllabus, and it's a real pleasure to share with you all the work that we've been doing with the filmmaking and activist team Defend Puerto Rico. First of all, I want to thank UC Santa Cruz's Center for Racial Justice for all their work hosting, supporting, and promoting this event. Established in 2019, the Center for Racial Justice aims to bring students, faculty, local communities, and invited guests together in much needed campus-wide dialogue on race and racial justice. The Center for Racial Justice seeks to facilitate fruitful collaborative service learning and public humanities possibilities for students, both undergraduate and graduate. The Center for Racial Justice, with their mission of centering political education, are truly the ideal sponsors for this event. And in particular, we'd like to thank Chisa Hughes and Domingo Canizales for the logistical and tech help, as well as Christine Hong for her support of the program. And of course, thank you all so much for coming. And now I'm going to pass it over to Marisol.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marisol Lebron. I'm one of the co-founders and project leaders of the Puerto Rico Syllabus, a feminist collective dedicated to providing critical tools for thinking about Puerto Rico's intersecting disasters. The Puerto Rico Syllabus is a collaborative digital resource that uses social scholarship to circulate information about Puerto Rico's fiscal, economic, social, and environmental crises in both English and Spanish to a broad audience. The site began in 2017 as a hashtag campaign to address topics related to Puerto Rico's deepening debt crisis. Given that public debt is often discussed in narrow economistic terms, the syllabus sought to emphasize humanities-based approaches in order to historicize the debt crisis, place it in a larger framework of colonial relationships, and emphasize race and gendered experiences of indebtedness and austerity. As the project has continued to develop, it has morphed from a hashtag campaign into a public syllabus that has provided guidance through its website and social media platforms to students, scholars, journalists, artists, and activists seeking reliable tools to make sense of the present day challenges.
Hace sentido de el día a día y la
As part of today's event, we're really excited to share with you all the collaborative viewing guide that the team created to accompany the film War Against Our Schools. Following the screening of the film, we'll go through the viewing guide's various components. We hope that this provides a resource for educators and organizers working to combat school closures and privatization in Puerto Rico and elsewhere. This is definitely imagined as an interactive community event. We encourage you to join the chat throughout the event and exchange with us and each other. If you're on Twitter, feel free to tweet about the event using the hashtag Defend PR, X, PR Syllabus, hashtag War Against Our Schools, and hashtag La Guerra, and we'll put those all in the chat as well. I'm gonna turn it over now to Mikey Cordero to tell us about Defend Puerto Rico and the film War Against Our Schools. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey everybody, I'm Mikey Cordero from Defend Puerto Rico, one of the co-creators of the project and the director of the War Against Our Schools. So Defend Puerto Rico started in 2016 as kind of a response to a neglection in the media for what was going on in Puerto Rico. We've been creating short form media and short form documentaries ever since then, along with a few long length documentaries, and really have our practice in media advocacy in Puerto Rico. So a lot of our work is not only the impact of films, but also how it gets back to the communities, and the communities utilize these instruments of like storytelling to bring resources to their back to their communities. The War Against Our Schools is a perfect example of a project like that. We started shooting the War Against Our Schools back in 2018. And we spent a few years interviewing and talking to the Federation of Maestros in Puerto Rico, and also visiting a few of the sites you're gonna see in the film that have reclaimed spaces and reclaimed their schools in Puerto Rico. We are very excited to be able to like show this film in addition with this viewing guide. And we're very excited about the collaboration with PR Syllabus, and you see Santa Cruz, in order to bring this viewing guide and have this be a supplemental material for you guys to use at your organizations, at your schools, to universities. And can't wait to unpack it with you at the end of the film, so stay tuned. In regards to watching the film tonight, the best way to watch it is, of course, utilizing the Zoom function of full screen view. In order to view the film in the biggest possible way, you could click the top right corner. You should see a button with 9 icons, and it says the word view. And there you can click standard view, or you could click full screen. And that would be the best way when viewing the film. After the film ends, we're gonna come back to this panelist view, and we'll be able to unpack the film, unpack the viewing guide, and take any questions or answers after the film. Marisol, are you ready to start screening?
Well, thank you so much to Defend Puerto Rico for gifting us with that wonderful film. And again, thank you everyone for being here. It's, I think, the 6th time I've seen this film, and I learn something new every time, I think. So my name is Sarah Molinari. I am a co-founder of the Puerto Rico Syllabus and a postdoctoral research associate at Florida International University. I'm going to talk a bit about the collaboration for the viewing guide now, and then we're going to actually present the viewing guide and then go into an audience Q&A. So this collaboration and the idea to do a viewing guide actually came out of a conversation that I had with Francis Medina over dinner in the fall in Puerto Rico. And I had seen a virtual screening of this film and just found a lot of synergies between my work and the film, and just wanted to find a way to conspire really with Defend Puerto Rico and think about how we can combine our focus on digital pedagogy with Defend Puerto Rico's political education work. So what became a semester-long collaboration, working towards this viewing guide and producing this event, was nurtured by both organizations' commitment to cultivating dialogue and building counter narratives. Defend Puerto Rico does this through storytelling, and the Puerto Rico Syllabus does this through archiving, providing critical education resources for learning and thinking about Puerto Rico's compounding crisis. I'm sorry, I'm having some internet connectivity issues here. Okay, so I'm going to keep the camera off for a second while this just stabilizes, but for us at the Syllabus, working with Defend Puerto Rico contributed to our goal of moving the production of the syllabus in a more collaborative direction. We were thrilled that this is our first collaboration to center education resources in support of activist multimedia production and circulation. And following the film's invitation to connect disaster capitalism and education privatization between Puerto Rico and New Orleans, the viewing guide is the first resource that we at the Puerto Rico Syllabus have co-produced to explicitly consider Puerto Rico in relation to other case studies of racialized geographies in the United States. And so the viewing guide that Isabel and Marisol are going to present consists of a few components. We have a microsyllabus that provides resources in English and Spanish, including academic, journalistic, and multimedia sources, to historicize and contextualize key themes that emerge in the film, as you'll see in a second. And this is also in keeping with our tradition in the Puerto Rico Syllabus of building out themes in critical historical contexts. We also include questions for group and self-reflection and an activity tool that invites viewers to reimagine and think about ways to engage abandoned spaces in their own communities. So we hope that the viewing guide travels with the film. The film is on tour in Puerto Rico right now, and we hope that this travels in person, it travels virtually, that it inspires curiosity, solidarity, critical thinking, and political activation across communities, activist groups, and educational settings. So on behalf of the Puerto Rico Syllabus, again, I just really like to thank Defend Puerto Rico for this semester-long collaboration, and thank you, Francis, especially for that dinner conversation that inspired this work. And I will turn this over to Marisol to discuss the microsyllabus component of the viewing guide.
Hey folks, thank you, Sarah, for giving us some context on the viewing guide. So I'm gonna say those famous Zoom words, which is I'm gonna share my screen. And I'm gonna actually go ahead and pull up the viewing guide here. And you know, we did a run through the other day and I was told to open a new window, so you all didn't see all of my tabs open. But essentially, you know, I'm going to walk us through the microsyllabus portion of the viewing guide. And so Sarah and I worked closely on this. And I just want to also acknowledge that Sarah did a lot of the very heavy initial lifting with some of the initial sources and framing, and that, you know, as a collective, we all really tried to work together to identify what we saw as the key themes emerging in the film, but also, as Sarah noted, really where these historical linkages were, right? To say that this is not something that has just been since the hurricane or since the passage of Ley Promesa, right? But that we can actually think about these efforts to dismantle public education in Puerto Rico as a much longer process, but also to think about the activism against this privatization, such as the rescates de terreno, as also part of this genealogy the activists are drawing on now. So in the chat, you all should see a link to this viewing guide. So please use it. It's downloadable. You can also, through this site, request access to the film. So if you are working with community partners, if you are a professor at a university or a student that's part of a student group and you're interested in bringing the film to campus or having the library purchase the film, this is a way to connect with Francis and Mikey to get access to the film, right? We really want this to be a film that circulates, and we created this guide in the spirit of trying to really give learners and community members as many opportunities as possible to get into this topic. So we have some kind of framing comments here at the beginning about the ways in which public education has been targeted as one of the key sites of privatization in Puerto Rico, and the ways in which the kind of compounding disasters of the debt crisis, Hurricane Maria, the earthquakes have really served to accelerate that process, right? So we set this up in terms of some of the context, also what's happening in Puerto Rico, but also recognizing that, for lack of a better, like, you know, not to be like punny, right? But we can't treat Puerto Rico as an island unto itself, right? We can't treat it in a super insular way. We need to connect it to these other struggles that are happening globally to protect public education, and in particular to defend Black diasporic communities from these kind of forms of extraction, right? And that's something that comes up in the film as well. So after this kind of these framing remarks, you have here this microsyllabus. And so what we really tried to do is provide some key background information for learners and community members. So this is really for folks who are either like, you know, students. So if folks are educators and want to use it in their classroom, but also for folks who might be like autodidacts, right? So that if you are kind of interested in this topic, you can dive in through this microsyllabus and get started with understanding some more themes that emerge in the film. And so we started by contextualizing Promesa and the debt crisis. And so what we tried to do for each of the sections of the microsyllabus was really, which was really, really, really hard, was try to just choose like 3 or 4 sources that really give learners a really great synopsis and understanding of some of these key issues. We also tried to include multimedia when possible, just to give learners an additional entry that was not text-based into the syllabus. So we started with Promesa and the debt crisis. We were able to include a more kind of multimedia piece, which was a panel discussion about Se acabaron las promesas, and activist efforts and protest efforts that were happening in response to the passage in 2016 of Ley Promesa and the ways in which that put Puerto Rico under this fiscal dictatorship, essentially, which accelerated the process of the school closures like we saw in the film. We then went and zoomed in more on the specific scope of the school closures in Puerto Rico, more information on just kind of how many schools had closed, what communities were most targeted, and how to kind of contextualize the school closures. We then talked specifically about the effort to impose charters and other privatization efforts in Puerto Rico. And so for us, this was something also as part of the PR syllabus team that was really crucial for us. And, we were grateful for the opportunity for this collaboration, because as the syllabus, we had tended to focus more on public higher education. So we have a lot of resources on the Puerto Rico Syllabus's kind of main site, which deals with efforts to privatize the UPR. And so this gave us actually an opportunity to think more about really the whole landscape of these efforts to privatize education in Puerto Rico and how this fits into this larger effort to really remove community control and to really dismantle kind of these spaces for radical coming together, right, in these communities. And so this was something that we were really happy to be able to kind of talk more about this. We also, so this is the longest section. I know I said that we tried to limit it to 3 or 4 sources per section, but in this section, we actually provided resources for folks who wanted to know more about other places where this was happening, right? And so we looked at New Orleans, Chicago, and Detroit. So in the film, we saw activists from New Orleans who compared the experience of New Orleans and the privatization of schools there, especially the imposition of charter schools, as very similar to what happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And so, New Orleans, I think, provides a really important example, but New Orleans is also part of this larger landscape where we see these efforts aimed at dismantling community control over schools, right? And in particular, targeting Black communities, right, with dismantling the public education system there. So we looked at Chicago and Detroit, and here again, we really tried to veer away from just having kind of really highly academic pieces and look at podcasts, journalistic entries, all these kind of long form journalistic pieces that really give you an understanding when you look at these other cases, the way in which what happened in Puerto Rico, while it has local iterations, is really part of a larger conservative playbook, right? And so the importance of that for us, for highlighting that, was as a grounds for building solidarity, right? Not only between the Puerto Rican diaspora, right, and what's happening in the archipelago, but also between other communities in the US. We also then go in to talking about apoyo mutuo and mutual aid, right, as we saw at the end in terms of the responses, right? So not just focusing on this top-down process of privatization, but talking about community responses. So we have some interactive resources there, such as a map that was created that shows you kind of the network of mutual aid that's happening in Puerto Rico. And then we also have Dean Spade's translated version of his book on mutual aid, which is completely free, which we were really excited to be able to put up, as well as some other resources. So we kind of conclude with 2 pieces on the rescue movement. So thinking about what's happening with these groups that are profiled in the film, they are taking back schools as part of a larger history of rescates in Puerto Rico, particularly thinking about the rescate terreno in the 80s, and then again in the early 2000s in Dominican communities in Puerto Rico. And then also just ending with some more information on this larger school rescue movement in Puerto Rico, right? Because these are 3 organizations that are doing this work, but trying to think about what are some other efforts that are happening. And then we just have to end two primary sources for folks to look at more closely, which is the Educational Reform Law of 2018, and then Ley Promesa, which is what institutes the Fiscal Control Board. And so, you know, as you can see, there's a lot of different resources, a lot of different entry points for folks. We're hoping that this is something that the community activists and educators, you know, we really had in my high school and college, but I think that there's also space here for lower grades in K through 12 to also have some entry points with students and viewing the film. So I'll stop there and let Isabel jump in and tell us a little bit more about the discussion questions. Thank you.
Hey. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the teaching tools that are included in the viewing guide. So these are divided into 3 sections: questions for self-reflection, questions about the film, and lastly, an activity. So the questions for self-reflection are designed to be engaged with prior to watching the film. These questions prime viewers by having them consider their biases and assumptions related to education. So one that I want to highlight is number 3, that states, reflect on your own educational and communal experiences. We typically think of schools as providing education and other spaces as providing community. How did your school foster a sense of community, and what other organizations or spaces fed your knowledge? So this prompt ideally, right, would help one question the typical ways that we think about education and community. The first part allows the future viewers to get a fuller sense of all the relationships and support that are lost when a school closes, right? It's not just education that is lost. And the second part of this prompt would help one see how education also goes beyond the school system, which I think is also a key part and perhaps an unexpected part of this film. And then going into the questions that directly address the film, one approach that I took was focusing on specific terms. And as an educator, I've always found that zeroing in this type of approach can be really fruitful. Some of the terms that I asked the students of the film to think about are land and space, right? What it means to occupy space in a colony. Scarcity, what it means to create abundance in a capitalist system. And sovereignty. And then in terms of the latter, one example is question number 10, where I ask viewers to think through 2 quotes. So this is what this question states. In the film, Jesus La Santa reflects on what the empowerment and autosuficiencia of school rescues mean in a colonial context. He states, "We made this possible without the help of the government, without FEMA, without the capitalists. In fact, without open doors, we have had to live independently." And then the second quote is, "You don't have to be independent to be free." What kinds of ideas about sovereignty do these statements reflect? So I thought that these 2 quotes were really interesting to think about together because they're clearly very related, but they're also expressing different ideas about sovereignty, right? The first one touches on the burnout and the abandonment that comes with autogestión and resilience. And then the second one seems more optimistic to me, where there's a recognition that empowerment does not wholly depend on the government or does not wholly depend on a particular political status. So as you can see, maybe my hope is that these questions can allow people to pause and to really tease out the drops of wisdom that are in these films' interviews. And then moving on to another question, I think that the main term, of course, that the film invites us to think about is education itself. The film both mourns the closing of schools, but it also shows how the situation has prompted new ideas of what education could encompass. And I feel like one question that addresses this is going back a little, Marisol, is number 7. This one states, "Mapensi Shivaleno no," states that La Conde, quote, "seeks to promote an education relevant to the community with the values and needs of the community, taking into account that the needs of the Black community are particular? How does Laconde's philosophy challenge or revise normative teaching methods, as well as the traditional content taught in schools? So I think that even as we mourn and contest the school closures, Laconde, which serves a largely Black community, is directly addressing the insufficiency and the white supremacy that is baked into traditional education. And I think that the film itself is an example of all the different ways that education can look. In the film, storytelling plays a pivotal role in educating viewers. And in relation to this, I want to read question number 13. This one says, did these stories inspire you in any way? For instance, did they activate you to form part of an organization, empower you to take over public space, make you question educational practices and policies, make you interested in learning more about disaster capitalism, foster a defense of public education? If you identify with one of these, what moment or aspect of the story or quality of the storyteller inspired you? So I think that it's interesting to try to break down exactly what part of the film, what aspect of the storytelling one finds particularly compelling and moving. So I invite you all to share in the chat, because it would be really cool to see different people's experiences with this. But lastly, I'm going to turn to the activity section, which continues with this theme of empowerment and agency. And the activity states, are there abandoned spaces or buildings in your community? Imagine different ways and purposes to rescue this space or an imaginary space. What communities would they serve? What needs or absences would they fill? So from what I gathered, it seems like Mikey and Francis always thought that this film wasn't just about seeing what specific people are doing, but that it could also be a model and a guide of what can be replicated by others. So I think that I wanted this activity, right, to be a way to begin this process. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marisol and Isabel and Francis. Would you like to talk a bit about the new directions for this guide and how the guide relates to the larger projects that Defend Puerto Rico is working on?
Yes, thank you, everyone. So more than anything, I'd like to thank Guerra Syllabus for the space for the work. I think Sara mentioned it, but it all started with a conversation over dinner in Puerto Rico. We're like, oh, this makes sense. Maybe there's a collaboration here. And I think for us, this is exactly what we would like to do with our films and with the other short documentary projects that we're working on, right? It's how do we think about diverse audiences and creating opportunities and space for not only dialogue, but for critical thinking, and also to entice action, right? Like, I think at the core of why we do storytelling is like, we want people to know that there is power, that we all have power in what we do after we watch a film, right? Whether that is sit down and have a conversation with our families, right? Whether that's like introducing it to your curriculum at your university, or just figuring out ways to do a screening, I think, or taking action, right? Like literally donating to one of the organizations featured in the film, right? That's always a big one for us. Or activating yourself when there's a call to action around an advocacy component. So I think for us, storytelling is more than us just picking up a camera and amplifying voices. We also want people to really have access to the narratives that inform, right? Like what it means to be a Puerto Rican, but also what it means to participate like in the globe as a citizen of the planet, right? Like how do we take action because we care about these issues? How do we link these issues to other issues, right? Because it's all connected. So I think the direction of the viewing guide is for it to serve as a tool, one of many tools. We're also working with an organization in Puerto Rico, an initiative called Pueblo Crítico. They develop tools on popular education. And so the whole idea of rescuing a space, what does that mean, right? How can we imagine, right, occupying spaces? And that's a tool we're developing with Pueblo Crítico. So this is one of many tools, and the idea is to reach as many diverse audiences as possible. We can't just keep our content on social media. We want to take it into classrooms. We want to take it into community centers. We want to take it into your living rooms, because that is where we get to really like see what impact could look like on a united front, right? So the vision for the viewing guide, particularly for the one on war against our schools, is to serve as a model for what we can do for future films, right? We want this to be an example, and we're going to continue to hopefully work with PR Syllabus to do this, because I mean, when we do these films, we've always imagined like something bigger and more, you know, like how do we get people to talk? And I think this is like exactly what we envisioned, and we couldn't have done it on our own. That's why we do what we do. PR Syllabus, that's what they do, right? And I think for us, the most important thing is we're open for collaboration. We want this film to make it as far as possible. And so we're figuring out different models where we can either license the film to different universities, or like Marisol had mentioned before, maybe there's ways for libraries and distinct departments to buy the content. We're exploring this. And the idea is because we want to keep producing films. And we also want to make sure that we're supporting the organizations and initiatives that we collaborate with. Like, we're not your traditional like documentalists. And that's Pepe, my nephew, sorry. We're not your traditional documentalists where we come and we do extractive type of storytelling. I think that's at the core of what Defend PR does. We want to support and be in service to like making sure that the organizations also have what they need to continue to do their work. So yeah, I think I said enough, but the idea is to continue to develop tools. We want to collaborate, we want to grow, and we want to partner with more thought partners, right? That's what we're looking for. Like whatever we can't do, we need support in. And I think that this is why this collaboration has been so important and so crucial for us. So thank you very much, and honored to be in this space, and looking forward to doing a lot more with everyone in this space.
Thanks so much, Frances. We are too, and I think we're we're totally up for continuing this collaboration. We have more ideas for how the viewing guide can develop. We want to collect audio, collect stories, right? Stories of people who are viewing the film and using the viewing guide. So we're going to work on a function on the viewing guide website. We also want to do a full translation to Spanish of the viewing guide. So stay tuned. It's a work in progress for sure. So let's go into the Q&A now. We have lots of great questions coming into the Q&A function. And I want to start with one from Maggie. And I think this is good for Defend Puerto Rico, because you all have been working directly with these communities now on the Gira Comunitaria, and your work really shows the story of struggle and resistance. So Maggie's question says, what are the realistic possibilities for reclaiming school buildings on behalf of communities? The public school curriculum itself needs to be decolonized. Should these school buildings actually replace colonial schooling with culturally relevant learning? So yeah, like what have you all learned about the possibilities of reclaiming schools?
It's very possible. It's very realistic to reclaim school space in Puerto Rico, and people are doing it. These are just 3 spaces that we had the privilege and opportunity to like highlight, but there's so much more spaces like this in Puerto Rico happening. And I think what is part of the issue also is the bureaucracy around the process to reclaim space. Sarah, I know you did some work on this, and I think I heard you say it best, where this process is very kind of so dysfunctional and oppressive that it kind of makes people not want to go through the process of reclaiming a space, or like formally and officially from the government taking back a school space and like owning it, something like what La Conde did. They kind of discussed a little bit about what that process was and how long it took them. But like she says in the film, the government in Puerto Rico and the bureaucracy around these processes and getting anything done in Puerto Rico, it takes a long time, and it encourages people to give up. So when we do see communities like this, like that one there, and there's many more, go through that process and survive it, right? And go through and be able to reclaim their space. That took a lot of work, and that took a lot of emotional dedication to what they wanted to do, to what they believed in, and to the love that they had for their community, right? Because why else would you go through this process, you know? So, you know, there are realistic possibilities for reclaiming space. And the idea, you know, I think, you know, you kind of, the person who asked the question kind of hit the nail around decolonizing our education, right? Not only decolonizing it, but I think there's a capitalist structure that education exists in, especially in the US, and being that Puerto Rico is a colony of the US, it has adopted some of that capitalistic kind of mentality towards education. And I think, yes, we need to decolonize education. And I think a lot of these organizations that are being developed and taking back these schools are in the process of also reimagining what the curriculum, what a new curriculum that's more culturally relevant and is more about the visibility about the members of this community, right? So that people in the community see themselves in their education, right? And so we know that groups are focusing on this and are hyper aware of what education could look like and what it should look like for them in Puerto Rico and culturally.
I will also add that it looks different in every community, right? Every single process for every single space in every single community looks different. With the 3 examples we showed, they all had very distinct legal processes. Some weren't even legal. Some are still in the process of figuring out what's legal, what's not. So I think that that's what Mikey's getting at. The bureaucracy of it all makes it very difficult and is very discouraging. But one thing to remember is that, you know, like for each of these there's not a straight arrow, right? Like there's not one process or a one glove fits all, right? Like these communities really have to figure out, one, what are the needs of the community after the school is shut down? Because those needs change, right? When a school closes in a community and families have to relocate or are displaced, that means there's no more kids in the community. So if you want to rescue a space, what does that space then turns into, right? What does that space then like evolve into? And that's a lot of the conversations that these communities are also having. So there's a lot of different layers of what it looks like now to rescuing these spaces. Another thing is that many of the schools that were closed had been recently rehabilitated, right? Like they had like functioning technology and were ready to receive students, right? And since then, since the doors have closed, these places have gone to waste, right? So there's just so many different layers of it. And I think that it really does take, the community figuring out, well, what do we want to do now? Does it make sense to open it up as a school again? Or what's going to be the function of the space? And that's why the tools that we're creating with Pueblo Critico in particular are supposed to explore that a little bit. Like, how can we reimagine this space if we don't know anymore whether it can serve its original purpose? So, yeah.
Great, and there's a lot of comments also coming into the Q&A suggesting different kinds of collaboration. So I think it would be great if the Puerto Rico Syllabus and Defend Puerto Rico could drop our emails into the chat. I think we're both really open to keeping in touch with folks and figuring out ways to collaborate, ways to share these resources and build new resources and collaborations. A lot of questions are coming in simply about how to help, like how to get involved, how to support teachers' struggles, how to support Defend Puerto Rico's work, how to support, how to defend education. So I'm wondering if if Defend Puerto Rico has thoughts about that, like how can people, especially in the diaspora, get involved with this work?
Yeah, right now, if you go check our website, laguerrapr.com, there's a button for community support, where you could be directed to the different spaces featured in the documentary. And also the Federación de Maestro has a campaign right now where they're fighting against, everybody is fighting against the Fiscal Control Board in Puerto Rico now, who's threatening their retirement, right, and their livelihood as teachers and as educators in Puerto Rico. So there's links to connect to those different organizations and those different campaigns where you could donate, where you could support and things like that. Right now, we're on tour with the film in Puerto Rico alongside another great film, El Último Timbre, which is, some people were asking about student voice and parent voice. We think that film is a great complementary film to watch with ours because it actually explores more student and parent voice in response to the closures. So we highly suggest, if you can, try to get a hold of that film and watch it. And we're doing a tour with it in Puerto Rico right now, where we're screening both films side to side in the communities all around the island and Vieques.
Great, and I think on our end too, the Puerto Rico syllabus, we continue to expand and again invite collaborations. Please email us, follow us on social media. We see ourselves again as an evolving resource and a living archive. So we hope to add folks to that mix as we keep evolving. I did have a quick question for Defend Puerto Rico about how those links went for you when you were making the connections between New Orleans and Puerto Rico, because that for me was one of the most striking things about the film, that you brought those voices directly in. And it was really cool on the Puerto Rico syllabus's end to, build a small section of the microsyllabus that spoke specifically to these case studies that are parallels to Puerto Rico. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how that emerged, the work with New Orleans.
At the start, I can start, Mickey, and then you can chime in. But at the start of the collaboration to do this film, there was a threat of privatization of public education in Puerto Rico, right? And the introduction of the first ever charter school, right, was something. Sorry, that's living in Puerto Rico for you. And the intro to of a charter school was something that was really frightening for the Teachers Federation of Puerto Rico, because what would it look like to introduce, right, private charter schools post-disaster, right, without really understanding how that would shake things up in Puerto Rico in the middle of like a debt crisis, et cetera, right? And one of the perfect examples, right, was what happened after Katrina in New Orleans, right, with the explosion of charter schools after disaster, and what that did to public education. So I think for us, that was we were thinking disaster capitalism, and then the possibility of, or that the idea that we were going to have our first, right, private charter school in Puerto Rico was something that we needed to sort of like figure out, like, what does this mean? There is a natural connection, and what happens post a disaster to our public, right, institutions. And Mikey, you can add to that too, if you like.
No, yeah, I think so. We were lucky because there was actually like a schools justice conference in Puerto Rico happening. So we were able to kind of infiltrate that conference and talk to a lot of these folks that were coming in from New Orleans, from Chicago, from New York. And that's where we kind of got a lot of bulk of that narrative in the film, because they were coming out here to visit Puerto Rico for the conference. And there was actually an exchange between FMPR And these folks coming in, they had panels, so the connection was already being made, and people were definitely on top of seeing this connection of what happened in New Orleans after Katrina, and what was happening here in Puerto Rico after Maria. So that, that started right after Hurricane Maria, and that conference, I believe, was in 2018. So, those connections were really being made. So we were lucky to kind of catch some folks that were visiting and able to like support that narrative. And then, Mapensi from La Conde, mentions it directly also. So people in Puerto Rico are very much aware of the connections, especially Black communities, and the effects of disaster capitalism. And yeah, if that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Mikey and Francis. I wanted to go to Tuyin's question about where to start. Tuyin says, I work with teachers. Where would you start within the syllabus or elsewhere with teachers? Would this be different from where you would start with students?
So I can jump in, and Sarah, if you want to follow up, but I think part of how we envision this is very much part of how we think about the larger project of the Puerto Rico syllabus, is really that we try to give people a lot of places to start with, depending on what their interests are. So, I mean, I think the kind of most obvious place to start is with the film, right? So viewing the film, and I think I like watching it, sitting with it, identifying what are the parts that really resonate, what are the parts that are distinct from experiences that you may be having, right? And what are the things that you want to know more about? And then I think for us, we really try to, there are kind of like discrete categories with the syllabus and the larger learning guide, right? With the discussion questions. But, I could see for teachers and students, right, that starting at the end, right, starting with the activity and getting that kind of creative energy flowing to really think about the spaces that exist in your community that have been allowed to deteriorate or they are abandoned, and that there are other uses for, right? And so actually allowing that to be a bridge for critical thinking and solidarity, I could see starting at the end in some ways, right? But really there's so many different points of entry, and I do think that it is in some ways kind of, maybe grade age specific, or also like interest specific, right? So if you are a solidarity organization in the diaspora that's trying to figure out how to get more involved, right? Or what's going on the ground, you might start with the info on the apoyo mutuo and mutual aid and try and identify what's happening, right? So it really depends on the interest. But what we tried to do was to create these kind of categories so that they intersect, but that they're also discrete in a way so that you could really get started anywhere, right? And in the way that makes the most sense, and that you can use the parts of it that make the most sense for you, right? So, I mean, we would love if for everyone, every part of everything on this site is usable and workable and gets you thinking and gets you plugged in, but we know that that's not how people function, right? And so it really is created to have these multiple entry points.
Yeah, thanks, Marisol. I totally agree with that. And we have a few more minutes, but maybe we can wrap up with one more question from Monisha, who thanks everyone for making the film possible. And Monisha is curious about how much the film cost to make. But I think beyond cost, this is also a question about the nuts and bolts of filmmaking in Puerto Rico and your creative process. And I know just from conversations with Francis how much film you actually have, and then it's tons more than what actually we see here in the documentary. So do you want to just talk about your creative process and the production process?
It's a beautiful disaster. No, I'm just kidding. I think Yeah, I think Mikey could speak more on, like, from a director perspective. We had little to no budget for this. This was someone who approached us and said, hey, we want to talk about this issue. Here's some funding, right, Mike? Yeah, I think these projects could be anything from free because we were volunteers at that time, right? So like, yeah, I'll let Mikey touch on this specific project, but honestly, for us, we're always looking for support to document, although we've been doing this work like for free without funding for the most part, unless things come in through a partnership or a grant. So yeah.
Yeah, like Francis was saying, this kind of started with actually a collaboration for organization that wanted to highlight the privatization of schools in Puerto Rico. So we were able to kind of start this narrative there, but then it evolved into not only privatization, but also the reclaiming of school spaces. It kind of took on a life of its own outside of that. So us as Defend Puerto Rico, you know, we were already in the practice of storytelling and doing kind of short form storytelling in Puerto Rico. And this is kind of one of our more longer form documentaries. It's still a short documentary, but it kind of evolved into that because it was originally going to be, I think, a series and episodic. And we kind of just decided to bunch it all together and release it as a short film. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, we started with just a small, really small grant to get started on the privatization of schools, and then it just developed into a larger project. And now we're able to submit it to festivals, and that's kind of how we got it distributed a little bit during the pandemic, especially. You know, they had like many virtual festivals that were featuring our documentary. And now coming out of the pandemic, we have this community tour happening in Puerto Rico, where we're able to bring the film back to not only the communities that we feature in the documentary, but other communities that are going through kind of similar situations in Puerto Rico. Yeah, and we actually got funding for that tour that has helped tremendously kind of bring the film back around to the communities and support the communities with real impact. So we're hoping to, do a part 2 of this tour, because once you start, you know, everybody starts coming out wanting to feature this film all around the island. And then we start discovering that there's even more spaces of people trying to reclaim schools, and that there's these closed schools that communities do want to get involved with. So we're like in this discovery phase of this, wow, this narrative is not done, and this story is not done. So what is the next step for us? And I think it's taking this film back to these communities, and then looking at how to distribute it in the States, especially where, you know, we have a connection between communities in the diaspora and communities in Puerto Rico. But yeah, we started with, you know, this is guerrilla filmmaking at its finest, you know, and the hopes is that, you know, we show people what these communities are going through. We show a story, and that empathy kind of drives more impact and resources and support once we finish the film.
Thank you so much, Mike and Francis, again, and thank you, everyone. We have to wrap up here, but just a reminder, Isabel just posted above both our collective's email addresses. We've been trying to answer some questions here individually. If we haven't been able to do so, please send us an email. I love that there's very specific collaboration ideas coming in here, so let's try to follow up with that. Please consider using and sharing the viewing guide, and just spreading the word about it. And I hope you can continue engaging with the film, and whoever is in Puerto Rico over the summer, please check out the Gira Comunitaria. So just one last thank you again to Defend Puerto Rico for this wonderful collaboration, to the UC Santa Cruz Center for Racial Justice for the sponsorship, and to Babia Collective for all the interpretation and language justice services. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight.